Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Automating Mobile Gestures with Appium. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes so you know how to participate in today's event. When you joined the webinar, your audio may have connected via your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select Phone Call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you have questions for our presenter, then please submit them via the questions pane in the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's event. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded and you will receive an email with links to view the recording and the slides following the event. Okay then, it's now my pleasure to introduce Wim Sellis. Wim is a solutions architect at Source Labs. He helps solve automation challenges by day and practices his passion for front-end test automation at night. Wim enjoys creating his own Node.js modules and contributing to open source projects. So then, without further ado, I'll turn this over to Wim.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, and everybody, thanks for joining us today in this webinar. And you might be wondering, automating gestures with Appium, why this subject? Well, there are three reasons why I've selected this subject. And the first one was that a few weeks ago, Ministry of Testing had an automation week. And during that automation week, people could use an app and start automating that application. And there were three challenges. And one of the challenges was to automate a gesture. And Mark and Richard were doing that live on YouTube. And I saw them struggling with the gesture. So I thought maybe we need to do something about that. The second reason for selecting this topic is that gestures play a very, very important role in how apps, especially mobile apps, are being used. And as you can see here, this is from the Apple website. We've got all types of gestures. We've got tap, we've got drag, flick, swipe, double tap, pinch. And if I just look at all our customers and what they're testing, this is not something that a lot of our customers are testing. So I thought maybe I can help everybody, also who's not a customer of Source Labs, but everybody who's joining this webinar, maybe I can help them to look into gestures. And the third reason is that when you're not using gestures, you might have bugs in your app. Because like I mentioned here already in this slide, when you're using an application, you're using your fingers, you're swiping, you're scrolling, you're doing everything with your fingers on your mobile phone. Let me just give you an example of that. This is just a website. This is the website of Source Labs on the Chrome browser. And here you can just swipe with your finger through the application. But what I see a lot, what people are doing they're doing some JavaScript injection in the page. As you can see here, they're injecting something and say scroll into view. But what if you have a bug in your application? I'm now going to create that bug in my application. I'm going to implement a bug that I'm not able to scroll. And you can see it here. I cannot scroll. The only part that you see me scroll is basically the address bar that's going to hide, but I cannot go to the bottom of the page. And if I would do a JavaScript injection, like you see here, I can just scroll. And if I would use the JavaScript injection during my automation will pass. But when I go to production, I will have an issue. So those are the three reasons why I wanted to have this subject for the automation, for this webinar. And when we're looking at Appium, you always need to have a point to start with. And the point to start with is just to go to the documentation. To go to the documentation of Appium, and then you will see a page like this. And if you would then walk through the page, it might even scare you a little bit about all the things that you need to know about the difference between iOS, between Android, and what you need to do to create those gestures. And let me just tell you something. There are two ways to create gestures. There's an easy way and there's a hard way. And today I'm not going to start with the easy way. I'm going to start with the hard way. And I might now already see a few people here like, why? Why would you do that? Why would you start with the hard way? Well, the reason for that I'm choosing the hard way is that if we know how to create a gesture based on some steps, we know how to create different types of gestures. by learning the basics, we can create beautiful multi-touch gestures. And also the hard way will tell us more about how we can create a gesture that can be used for Android and for iOS. So not something that's specifically for iOS or for Android, but create something which is cross-platform, meaning Android and iOS, but also cross-device, different screen sizes. Because if we look at iOS, we've got an iPhone 8, for example, but also the newest iPhone 12. There is a difference in screen size there. But if you would also look at the range of Android devices, well, I think you can already imagine we go from very small to the phablets or maybe even the fold phones. So if we're able to do that, to create something which is cross-platform, you only need to write it once and you can use it every time. You don't need to create specific gestures. So if we look at gestures and if we look at Appium, how will Appium support us with that? Well, I've already shown you a documentation page, but there are two commands that you could use to create those gestures. Let's just start with the first one, which is the touch perform. With the touch perform, you can create gestures based on what you would do when you would use your phone. An example here, you can already see some Java code here, is that you would press on your screen, you would move to a certain direction on your screen, a location on your screen, you would release it, and then you've done an execution, and you've done a touch perform. Touch perform itself can only be used in the native context. That means that if you have a native app, you can only do the action there. The advantage of a touch perform is that you can create multiple actions, and then all those actions will be sent to Appium. Appium will execute them right away, and then you will get a response back. So you're not sending each touched event to Appium, but Appium will receive them right away. There's also one thing, the touch perform itself, it's based on the JSON wire protocol, including a mobile part, but it's not W3C compatible. On the other hand, Appium can do both protocols, so I don't think you need to worry about that one. Then we also have a second one, which is the Actions API. The Actions API is basically the same as the touch perform API, but first of all, it's W3C compatible. And you can also use it in a web or a web view context. So if you're automating a web application or a hybrid application where you're in a web view, basically just in the website itself, you can also use it. There's one difference, or a big difference, it's that it's slightly more complex and also more verbose in what you need to write down in your code, which steps you need to take. And we're going to look at it in a few seconds. You also have some more options here with the actions. You can even do multi-touch gestures like doing pinching and zooming. So it's a little bit more powerful. And yeah, last but not least, it also supports Chrome browser, which is also already awesome. But to understand what we're going to do, I first want to show you the two gestures that we're going to use today to do the coding. First of all, we've got a scroll. And on the left, you would see our Swag Labs app. And basically, when you're logged in, you can walk through the swag items you could order. And this is a demo application, so you're not able to order all the swag you can find in here. You can download this one. I will also share that afterwards. But in this application, you can just do a scroll. The second gesture that we're going to automate today is the swipe. That's what you will see on the right side. And the swipe will compare it with, for example, WhatsApp. You can remove conversations for when you swipe it from the right to the left, or you can respond to chats that you get by also swiping it, and then you can respond to that one. So those are the two gestures that we're going to look at. And let us first take a look at the scroll. And I tried to explain this step by step. And for this case, I'm going to use the touch perform. First of all, if you would look at the behavior of a touch perform action, then we need to think about the following steps. We first need to press our finger on a certain location on the screen. And you can already see the red dot there at the bottom. This is where I would start. So I need to think about my X and my Y position on the screen. We need to determine that, and I will look into that in a few seconds. Then we need to move our finger from the bottom to the top, as you can see here. there are two things we need to be aware of. First of all, the position we want to go, the X and the Y position on the screen. And secondly, the speed. The faster you do this, the faster your scroll will be executed. And I will also show you that later on when we're going to look at some coding. And then last but not least, when you're done, you need to release your finger. And this is basically a touch perform action, a simple gesture on your screen. If you look at determining the position, you've got two options. And like I mentioned before, if you look at the hard way will give you the option to create something which is cross-platform. And to make something cross-platform, we need to know more about a device. And in this case, we need, for example, to know what the size of the screen is, because based on the size of the screen, we can determine, for example, the center on the X, the horizontal axis, and we can also determine the position of our finger when it goes from the bottom to the top, so the Y position. And what you see here, this is an option or a way to get the screen size by using driver.getWindow rectangles. If you would also go to the Appium documentation, I put the link in there, you will get more information on how to use it. But you can also see here the output for Android and for iOS. As you can already see, iOS is 414 times 896, and Android is much bigger. There's a small difference between screens, between Android and iOS. iOS will only give you the CSS pixels of your screen, but Android will also look at the density, the pixel density of your screen, and it will give you back the screen resolution based on the pixel density. And you will also get different resolutions back on different screens. But if we would use this method and we can determine the size of our screen, we already have something to determine the center position and also the position we want to scroll to, top or bottom, making this already cross-platform when we're using the window rectangles. There's a second option here to determine also some coordinates, and it is based on getting an element, getting the element rectangles. And in this case, we need to determine which element we want to have. We can then use get element rectangles, and the element rectangles only needs to have a specific element ID, as you can see here. And this will always also give you back the X, the Y, the height, and the width, basically the position and the size of that element on your screen. When you use this, you also have something which is cross-platform, because it will give different results for different screens and different phones. There's only one thing that I wanted to say here. If we look at determining the position, and especially if we're looking at scrolling from the bottom to the top, we always need to be aware of system things on iOS or system screens on Android. If you would go, for example, on this phone from the complete bottom, and you would swipe it up, you would basically close the application. And if you would go from the upper top to the bottom, and when you do the scrolling, you would get the system notifications from Android, for example, or you would get the system notifications of iOS. That's something you need to keep in the back of your mind, that every phone might have different system handling or notifications on the left, on the right, the bottom, or the top of the screen. So if you determine a position, always be aware of that you might need to add some extra pixels on top of it, or remove some pixels on top of, from that. And I will also show you that later on. Now that we've handled the scroll, let's take a look at the swipe. And for the swipe, I'm going to use the axis. If we look at the swipe, we can use basically the same logic that we use with the touch action. The only thing is that we need to set an event. This will be a touch event. Then what we need to do, and see this when you're using your own phone, if you want to swipe, you've got your finger here, you've got your phone there, you just need to bring your finger to the phone. That's also what we need to do with the Action API. We need to tell our finger, or basically Appium, to bring it to the phone. So that's the second step. We need to determine also the position to where we want to bring our finger. Then we need to press our finger on the screen. So we bring our finger in contact with the screen. That's the third step. The fourth step is to wait a little bit, because normally when you do this, when you look at how you use your application, how you are doing a gesture, you always wait a few milliseconds. So we also need to do that. And when we've done that, we need to move our finger to a certain position. And again, we need to determine the X and the Y, but also the speed. We need to determine the speed in which we want to execute that swipe to the left. Then when we're done, we need to move our finger from the screen, and basically we're done. This is a way on how to set actions with the Action API, and we're going to dive into that in a few minutes. The only thing we need to determine here is also the position of the element. Where is our element on the screen? And I want to swipe on this specific item in our cart. Well, it's basically the same what we did with the perform action. In this case, we just need to retrieve the element. The element will give us back the position on the screen. And again, we need to think about, will our phone have a notification on the right? Simple example, if you would have a Samsung Galaxy phone, maybe the Edge version, if you would swipe completely from the right to the left, you will get a certain system menu. So maybe put your finger a little bit more to the left. Always keep that in the back of your mind. So now that we know how to do this, based on theory, based on steps, let's try to do this with some coding. So let me stop sharing my screen and show you this screen. Hopefully everybody can now see an Android emulator on the left. We've got an iOS simulator here in the center, and we've got some code here in the center of our screen. What I've already done for you is I already created some examples, and you can use these examples afterwards. I will also share a link on how to use them and the repository where you can find them. But what I already prepared in this case, I've got it before each hook, and every test case will start with restarting the application, waiting for the screen to be there. So let me just do that now manually to give you an idea. We're going to wait here. We're going to add some data. We're going to log in, go to check the, use the easy way now. We're going to click on login and wait for this screen at least to be displayed. This is what our code is doing in the before each hook. And after each test case, it will basically close the application and it will remove it from the background with the reset. So every time we start a new test case, it will start with the initial situation, starting the app, waiting for the screen to be there. So now let us take a look at the touch perform. What we're going to do here is we're going to create something that will execute the scroll, starting from the bottom and going to the top. And what we need to have here, like I mentioned before, we can use the screen or we can use the element size. For now, I'm just going to use the screen. So in this case, I'm going to say screen size, sorry for typing, and this will be the driver get window rectangles. This will give us the X, the Y, and especially the height and the width of our screen. And it doesn't matter if we're taking Android or iOS, it will always give us back the correct data. Then what we need to do here is we need to determine the center on the horizontal axis, basically the X position. So if I would now open my app, and if I would just put my finger here, I need to determine this position. And I would always say just use the width of the screen divided by 2, and then you're in the center. So that's also what we're going to do here. We're going to use the screen size. It will return the width, and when we divide it by 2, we will have the center of the screen. I'm not going to, when I'm scrolling up, I'm not going to more to the left or more to the right. I just want to keep this number. So let's just copy this one and also put it here, because this will be the second position, the move to position, the to position. What we now need to determine is the Y position. Where do I want to place my finger initially? Well, first of all, if I want to do this, I can use the Y position, or I can use the height of the screen, which will be the bottom. In this case, I can say screen size, and I can say the Y. But if I would put my finger there, and if I would now look at my application, and I would put it at the bottom here, and I would drag it to the top, you would see that something else will happen instead of doing the scrolling, what I wanted to do. So in this case, what I would say is, I would advise you to remove some pixels from it. So not taking the, 896, but remove, for example, 100 pixels from that. So you will be at 700, meaning you will be a little bit higher. If you would do this, then you would prevent your script to open system menus. Then we also need to determine the end position. Where do we want our finger to be? Where do we want our finger to be released? In this case, we can just make it very easy and say, if we just go to the top, it can be 0. Just release it there. We will not trigger anything else. We will not trigger any system menus. So let's just put this to 0. But if you don't trust it, you can also put a higher amount here. This is basically the amount of pixels from the top to the position where you want it to stop. So now that we've determined the from position, basically the XY on the bottom of our screen to the XY on the top of our screen, we now need to code the touch perform. And we can do that with driver.touch perform. And the touch perform, like I mentioned, will get an X amount of actions. And each action is basically a step. And let me just copy this, and we're going to code every step here. Every action that we're going to execute here will contain at least an action. In the first case, it will be the press, because we need to press our finger on the screen. And we also need to provide some options. And the options are the position that we want our finger to start. So we will provide some options, and the options needs to be an object with an X and a Y position. In this case, I already created the from, so I can just say options is from. Then the second thing we need to do here, 3B, is we need to wait for the action to be executed. Kind of like this determines the speed. How fast are we able to do the swipe? So in this case, I would say await, because we need to wait for it. And the options needs to be in milliseconds. And for now, I'm going to use 1000 milliseconds, which will be 1 second of waiting. Then we need to do the same for determine the position of the end position of our finger. In this case, we're not going to say press, but we're going to say move to, because we're going to move our finger to a certain position. And then the options, the endpoint where we want our finger to be released, needs to be the 2, because we determined in this constant our end position. And then the last position, in this case, needs to be an action, and that action needs to be a release. So hopefully I copied, or I didn't copy, I created the code now for the touch perform. This should work on iOS and Android. So let us just take a look at iOS and just run this specific test case where we're going to determine the position of the screen. Let me focus on this test case, sorry. We're going to determine the position of the screen where we want to position our finger. We're going to execute the press. We're going to wait. We're going to move our finger, and we're going to release. And for demo purposes, I added 5 seconds of pause here just to show you that this should work. So demo gods, be with me, and let's see what will happen. We're going to execute it now on the simulator, and let's just see if this works, yes or no. Should put the app in the background, open it, should log in. That's the before hook that we created. It will then press on login, and now it should execute the touch. And now it's not executing the touch, so I didn't cross my fingers in the right way. Let's just see what happened and what I missed. And I don't get an error here. Let me just copy the code. This is always the demo. Let's get back to the code and see if I have it correct. We've got the screen size, we've got it here. Always, yes, this should be good. Let's just put this in here and execute it again. Always the demo gods. Let's do it again. We're going to do the press, we're going to do the wait, we're going to do the move to, we're going to do the release, start the app, and go from here. Yes, and it executed the scroll for us here. Now that we've done this, let's also take a look at Android. If we would execute this on Android, will this also work there? Let's just wait a few seconds. It should install the application. If the application is there, it should log in and it should give us the screen and it should scroll. Awesome. It also works on Android. Like I mentioned before, the speed itself will also determine how fast you will scroll and also the position on the screen itself. So if we would just change the speed here to, for example, 100 milliseconds, if we would execute this again on the iOS device, we would see that the scroll itself will be executed much faster. It will go immediately to the bottom. So the speed itself will determine where you will be at the end of your execution. Let's just see, and as you can see here already, it was much faster. And this is also how it works in life. If you scroll faster, you will go immediately to the bottom of your screen. So now that we've seen how to do this with the touch perform, let's also take a look at the touch actions for the swipe. And in this case, also for the swipe, we already prepared a test case. We just made sure that we are adding something to our cart. And now we're just waiting for our cart with the content, with the item already displayed in the cart itself. And I just now need to determine the position of the elements. When we've got the position of the elements, we need to determine the starting position, the X position, or the horizontal axis. That one will be constantly, or that one won't be the same. That one will be changed from the right to the left. Then we have the center Y. That's the coordinate that will stay the same the whole time, because I'm not going to swipe from a lower corner to an upper corner. No, I'm going to swipe in a straight direction. When we've done that, we need to execute all these steps. We need to create the event, move the finger into a starting position, and basically execute all these steps. So for now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the X, the Y, the width and the height. And I need to get driver dot, it will be the touch action. No, it will be the driver dot perform actions. And no, sorry, it needs to be the get elements rectangles, where I need to provide the element ID. I need to tell the element rectangles, or at least the driver, the Appium driver, give me the height, the width, the X and the Y position of this element based on the element ID. When I have this, I need to determine my starting X position and my center Y position. And like I already mentioned before, the center Y position is pretty easy to determine. We first need to have the Y, where does my element start on the screen? Then we need to add at least the height of that element divided by 2, because now we would have the center position of this element on the screen. What we then need to do is we need to determine the X position. Where do we want to put our finger on that screen? And in this case, we want to start almost at the right of the screen, the right of the element. So I can just take the X position, and then I need to say the width of that specific element. And just to be sure that I'm not touching any system menus, let's just abstract some numbers, some pixels from it, and let's just say abstract 100 from it. That will be the starting position of our touch event. Then when we've got this, we need to create our action, and in this case we need to create a perform driver action, driver.perform actions. This one also accepts an array, and that array needs to have one or multiple actions. And especially when you want to do multiple gestures, you can create 2 action objects here in this perform actions. For now, we're not going to do that. We're going to focus only on swiping from the right to the left. But if you would read the documentation on the Appium side, or maybe even go to a link that you would see here, there Jonathan Lips explained everything very clear on how to use this. You will also see an example on how to do pinching and zooming. But like I said, for now, we're going to focus on that specific swipe. We first need to create the event. And the event will be started here. We will start here with a type, and the type in this case will be a pointer. Then we need to provide an ID, and this ID is very important, especially if you have multiple actions. That one then needs to be unique. Let's just call this one finger 1, and then we need to provide some parameters, which will also be an object, and there we need to provide the pointer type. And the pointer type, let me just get this one. The pointer type can be a mouse, it can be a pen, or in this case, we need to use the touch. Touch needs to type it correctly, needs to be the touch. Now that we've created the event, we now need to execute the actions. So in this case, we're going to execute the actions. It will be, actions. That will be also an array, and then every action that we need to do, for example, moving our finger, should be a separate step in the actions array. So now we need to move our finger. That finger needs to be done based on a type, which will be the pointer move. We're going to move our finger. We need to give it a duration. In this case, it can just be 0, and we need to give it an X. The X position will be where we start our finger, and that will be almost on the right of that specific element. So that will be the start X. And then we've got the Y, and that will be the center Y. This is the first step after creating the event. This is where we want to move our finger to. Then, like I mentioned in the slides, we need to put our finger down. So in this case, we're going to create a new action. And in this case, we say type. This will be pointer down. And we need to provide at least a button. And the button, I don't know exactly why we need to provide a button here. Just give it 0 in this case, and then it can execute that specific pointer down. Then we need to pause for a little bit. This is basically when we move our finger, release it, or put it on the screen. So we can just say here, this will be the type, and the type will be of pause, and the duration will be, for example, 100 milliseconds. Then we need to have the finger move, and let's also copy it here, the finger move, which will be of the type pointer move, pointer move. There we also need to provide the duration. The duration, in this case, I'm going to set it to 250 milliseconds because the time it takes at least to do the swipe from the right to the left shouldn't be that long. And we provide the X position, so it needs to go to a certain position on the X axis, the horizontal axis, and that one could just be 0. It doesn't matter if it's 100 or if it's 0, we will not touch any system menus there. So let's just use the 0 here, and the Y position will still be the center Y. And then last but not least, when we're done, we need to lift our finger up again, and we can do that again with almost the same code we have here. We're going to do a pointer up. So hopefully, again, the demo gods like me, I coded this the right way. This one should determine the position of the element on the screen by asking the element rectangles. We will get back an X and Y, the X and the Y position on the screen, and also the width and the height. Then we determine the position where we want to put our finger to, the starting X position, the center of the element, and then we're going to execute all the steps that we already mentioned in the presentation, and hopefully it will execute the swipe from right to left. So let's start again with iOS and just see if I did a good job here with all the actions. Again, it's starting, it's going to log in. It's going to add something to the cart by clicking on the add button, opening the cart, and yes, as you can see, we're swiping here from the right to the left. Now let's also use this for Android. Run this same test case with the same code. There's no difference. They're not asking, am I Android or am I iOS or something, using this perform action on Android. So let us start the application. Log in. Select an item. And when we selected it, we're going to swipe from the right to the left. So as you've seen now, we created a method, now the hard way. By looking at it step by step, every time we are doing something with our finger, we basically coded that in these examples. And with this code, we created something which could be executed on an Android and on iOS. And it doesn't matter what your screen size is, where the elements are located on your screen. Appium will do the calculation for you. You only need to help Appium with certain steps. So now that we've seen this, we know how to do this the hard way. Yeah. Then you also might wonder, is there an easy way? Yes, there is an easy way. The only difference between the hard way and the easy way is that it's OS specific. If you would also go back to the Appium documentation, you would have a specific page for iOS mobile gestures, and you would also have a specific page for Android mobile gestures. The difference, and something you need to be aware of, is that the Android specific gestures were created by Mikola just in the latest release. He really helped everybody by just creating these simple gestures. And let me just show you those gestures. How do they look like? If I would go back and also to the documentation, on the left, you would see the UI Automator 2 options. Like I said, be aware of the fact that this will only work from Appium 1.19 or higher, but you would see an execute command option like a long click gesture, a drag gesture. You need to provide some arguments, an element ID, for example, the starting position and end position, and then it will do all the steps for you. So instead of creating all those steps with the touch perform or the touch actions, Android can do it for you. It's the same for iOS. We've got swipes, we've got scrolls, we've got pinches, we've got double taps. We can do everything based on some simple commands. So let's take a look at that simple commands. What do we need to do when we start coding this? Let me get back to the code here. Let me collapse this one. And let's first take a look at the scrolling. Again, we're going to use the before hook. And what I've done here, I'm using WebDriver IO. WebDriver IO has a very easy way for you to determine, am I Android or am I iOS? So the only thing we need to do now is to create two specific methods, one for Android and one for iOS. We can do that by using the execute command, because now we're basically going to inject a piece of code into Appium, and Appium will then determine what it needs to do. And we can do that by using the argument mobile and then say the scroll gesture. And then we need to provide some arguments here. And for the arguments, we need to think about the elements in which we want to scroll. So we need to provide an element ID and the element that we want to use to do the scrolling. Let me just log in here and just show you that the element that we're going to use is this container. It's a scroll container, and that scroll container has a specific locator. Let me just get that one. It's test and then products, and we need to have the element ID. Then we also need to provide the direction. Do we want to scroll down? Do we want to scroll up? So we provide the direction here, and that one will be down because I want to go down. And then what you can also do, or also need to provide with Android, is the percent. What's kind of like the size of your scroll? From where to where do you want to scroll? Do you want to scroll the complete container, or do you want to only use 50% or 80%? In this case, I'm going to say I just want to scroll the complete container, and then I should be done. It should be done here. This is the script for Android, but let me also already create this one for iOS. We again use the execute. The execute here also has the argument mobile. It would be the scroll. And we also need to provide some arguments here. And the difference between iOS and Android is that for iOS, you only need to provide the direction. You don't need to provide anything else, making this even a little bit easier for iOS in comparison to Android. So we created this for an Android and for iOS. Let's focus on this specific test case and let us just run this test case. With a few lines of code, without any extra steps, it should be able to execute the scroll gesture on the Android device, and it should be able to do the same on the Android and the iOS device with just a few lines of code. So let us wait, look into the left where we have the emulator, and it's already scrolling, as you can see here. You also have the option to provide an extra argument by saying, or an extra property by saying the speed, but you have all kinds of options here to tailor the mobile gesture for Android as you want. For iOS, let's just run this also, and let's just see how it looks like when we execute this with the driver execute command for iOS. Just wait a few seconds. And then it should log in. And when we logged in, we're going to execute the mobile scroll. So now only with, I put everything on a new line, but basically this could be a one-liner. With one line of code, you're able to execute at least a scroll on iOS, and maybe with 2 or 3 lines of code, you can execute a scroll gesture on Android. But we're not there. We also have the swipe. So let me now collapse this one, go back to this one, focus on here, basically execute the same or use at least the same structure for the command. For Android, we again do driver.execute. We would here say mobile, and then the scroll should be swipe. And then we should have the arguments. Again, what we need to have here is that we need to have the element. So the element we want to use to execute that specific swipe, this is a mobile gesture. So it should not be, it should be the swipe gesture, swipe gesture, sorry. What we need to provide here is the element ID. We already have the element ID here. I already prepared that one, so I can just say first element ID. And then we need to give it the direction. If we want to swipe from the right to the left, or if we want to swipe to the left, in this case, I want to swipe to the left. And then we need to provide also the percent. And the percent again will be the length of our swipe itself. I will put this one on 0.8. I forgot my comma here. And now we already have the swipe gesture here for Android. Now we need to do the same for iOS. It will be driver.execute. Again, we need to do a mobile, and then we say the swipe, and we provide a script here with the direction. The direction will be the left, and we also need to provide the element that we want to use to execute that specific swipe gesture to. And hopefully, when I coded everything properly, it should now work. Mobile swipe gesture. Let's just execute this one also on the simulator. Let's just see if this works out of the box, and maybe I can even run Android at the same time on my machine. Let's just see what will happen in this case. It should log in, it should select the product, add it to the cart. open it, the card, and it should swipe to the left. So iOS is done, Android is almost done. And now you've also seen that we can execute this with only a few lines of code. So what you've seen now is that there are two ways to execute your gestures. The hard way, by just constructing your actions yourself, or by using some mobile commands from Appium. That Appium will already help you execute those gestures. But what will happen if you created a gesture? And what will happen when you're not seeing anything? How can you debug that? Well, there's a way on how to do that, and especially on Android. There's a tip or a trick, depends on how you want to call it, on doing this. If you would have your Android device, and if you would open the settings on Android and you've got at least your developer options enabled, you have the opportunity to get visual feedback. So if you would go to the developer options, you would search for tabs and then enable tabs here, also enable the pointer location. You would now see at the top of your screen that you can track what your mouse or your finger is doing on the device. And as you can see now, it's drawing lines. And especially when you're going to execute mobile gestures on your device, and especially when you're not seeing anything happening, you could enable this on your emulator or on your real device. And now I'm even executing something with the automation. You could see the lines on my screen. So this could help you debug what's going on during your automation of your gesture. Like I mentioned also in the beginning, the repository can be found here. The slides will be shared afterwards, and you can get the code examples. You can get every link here that I also used in the presentation. So hopefully I've given you now the tools and the ideas about how to create those gestures and how to enrich your automation with mobile gestures. Because I think it really makes your automation stronger, and it could even reveal some bugs that you might have in your application by doing the gestures in the way that we've shown today. That was my presentation, and I don't know if there are any questions currently. So Andy, do we have some questions?
We do, yes, thanks, Wim. That was a fantastic presentation. We've got just under 10 minutes left for Q&A. We do have a couple, and there's a good one here. So are there any performance issues with gestures automation? And there's some further qualification here. I mean, several times Appium can be slow, which is okay. Well, this type of automation may be a bit too much if you don't have a strong CI machine or server. So what are your thoughts there, Wim?
Good question. And I think if you would look at that, there will not be any difference between a normal command that Appium will send to your device from your CI machine or from your local machine when you look at gestures or when you look at getting the source, for example, of your application. So if you would look at performance, no, there is no difference in using a gesture for the performance or using something else, using a different command. The performance things that you might see is that people might use selectors like, for example, XPath on iOS devices, which will slow down execution a bit because it will take some time to translate all the views into XML for iOS. That might be the thing that you're seeing, but basically the commands themselves, executing them from your CI machine or from your local machine to the Appium server, will not have a performance increase or decrease in this case.
Okay, thanks, Wim. Just to remind everybody, if you do have questions, please submit them through the questions panel. We do have another question. You've shown two ways of creating gestures, the hard way and the easy way. So which do you prefer and why?
Yeah, good question. I think, like I already mentioned in one of the first slides, is that it's always nice to go to the easy way right away. But see it as learning to walk. When you were younger and you needed to learn to walk, you first needed to learn to crawl. You need to know what to do to really learn to walk. And I think it's the same with the gestures. I would even prefer using the hard way, because then you have everything basically in your script, every step you need to take. It will give some extra lines of code in your script, but it will explain everything that will happen with your gesture. And also the hard way, like I mentioned, it's already cross-platform, so you don't need to create extra if-else statements in your code, extra conditions to say when I'm this, I need to do that. You've got one method to execute it, and you can use it in all different types of screens, different OS versions, different devices. It will work out of the box, basically. So yeah, I would definitely go for the hard way. Maybe that's just me.
I've known you for a long time. You've never gone for the easy way yet. So we've got one final question now. I'm automating a web application, so can I use gestures then?
Yeah, also a good question. Yes. When we go back also to the slides, and then especially to the Actions API, then you have the option when you're in a web context or in a web view of a hybrid application, you can use the actions. On the other hand, what I normally did when I needed to automate a hybrid application or a web application, I just switched to the context of the native application by just saying switch context to native app, execute basically all the actions that I needed to do, and then switch back to the web view or the web context, which I was previously in. That made it a little bit easier for me also to do the automation, because not every browser driver would support the Actions API. Like I mentioned, Chrome already supports the Action API. I'm not 100% sure now about the Safari driver or the iOS WebKit debug proxy that we're using for iOS. But yeah, I would prefer just going to the native context, execute those actions, and then switch back to the web view context, and then you can just do whatever you want to do.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Wim. Well, there aren't any more questions right now. Just to remind everybody, if you do have any questions after the event, please get in touch with us. All the information is provided. So again, that's all we have time for today. Thanks again to Wim for a fantastic presentation. And thank you everybody else for taking time out from your busy day to actually attend the webinar. When you exit the webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd greatly appreciate it if you provide your feedback on that brief survey. And you'll also receive a follow-up email shortly with links to viewing the recording and the slides from today's webinar. So then, on behalf of Source Labs and to Wim for presenting, thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.